Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fifth and final part, actually, of my series on the trivium. So, five-part series on a three-part educational concept. Sorry about that, but a little introduction and a little conclusion here to expand it out. Now, in this part, I want to add to what was not explicitly included in the trivium, but was either implied by the society. The society would have expected this, so you wouldn't have included it as part of the teaching. And then I want to add a little bit from the Renaissance and then a little bit from classical Chinese, particularly Taoism, to round out a sense of what I think the trivium could be in the modern world. So again, this isn't an attempt to reproduce the trivium exactly because some of the aspects of our world have changed. But again, the core mission of giving people the power to express themselves and to achieve their goals and desires and to understand them clearly, their world and themselves, this has not changed. And I think, as I mentioned in the previous sections, that understanding writing and reading to spend time with great minds and to be able to express yourselves and communicate with people, logic to understand how to receive, recognize, and construct valid arguments, if nothing less than so that you're not deluding yourself with error, which is, I don't think I mentioned this, or I certainly didn't emphasize that enough, but this is one of the key points, both of dialogues and of logic, is to make sure that we're not deluding ourselves with our own arguments with things like confirmation bias, where we only choose those pieces of evidence that support what we want to think and we reject those things that do not support it. And then, of course, rhetoric, which is the ability to communicate our concepts, our ideas to other people orally so that we can convince them or sway them, or if nothing else, have a successful conversation so that we feel heard and that we feel like we, again, have efficacy and we matter in the world. So to add to those three core principles, one, I want to talk about the physical. Now, in the classical world, exercise was central, in fact, more important than the trivium. This is the thing, is that the notion of a physically unwell person being taken seriously, I mean, it's almost problematic. Again, if you read the Socratic dialogues of Plato, if you read Plato's biography, right, the society put a huge emphasis on both militarism, because they were almost, classical Greek was almost continuously at war, but also physical competition of all kinds, hence the Olympics, coming from classical Greece. And so many of the dialogues begin either coming from the gymnasium or going to the gymnasium. Basically, they're going to exercise or they're coming from exercising, because these were social events, these were cultural moments where men, of course, exclusively men, except for Sparta perhaps, would gather to exercise. This was considered something you would do essentially daily, right? Like that was just a core. That you would be physically capable seemed an obvious good and physically well. And because it was a culture that valued that, it's just implied. It's like once you're out of your youth, once you've got your health, once you're vigorous, then you start taking on these other aspects because your self-presentation, and again, in a world where people are probably going to be seeing you a lot, this really mattered. And so it's one that we don't think about that much. Like if you think about how your school is organized, probably not 50% of the time is given to exercise and physical activity. And I think if you went to the classical Greek world, you'll see what this was a major component. All the way up into near modern times, if you had an instructor, you would be you had a personal tutor. They would be responsible for things like horseback riding, which is very physically demanding, fencing, very physically demanding, military drills, very physically demanding. So this all of a sudden, this notion of the intellect, the egghead intellect, who lives in they just sit around and read all day and they're unhealthy, and that evolved later during the classical era in particular, but even almost throughout till near modern times. The notion was that an academic life, an intellectual life, was an active, aggressive, participatory life, not one of retreat. This is why that people were very suspicious of the Epicureans, because Epicurus says, you know what, don't go out in the world, live in your own garden. Don't worry about all that stuff. You'll have less trouble. The general societal impulse, however, was to say, no, you want to be active, you want to be aggressive, you want to be in the world participating, and part of that is to be a physical presence, to be capable of commanding yourself and being able to walk from city to city if you're a peripatetic philosopher, or traveling was hugely challenging physically back in the day. So that notion goes, again, all the way through to nearly the modern age. You can also look at a civilization like the Persian civilization, where the three skills of a gentleman were to ride, again, physically demanding. This is part of what they're saying. It also is a sign of wealth, of course, but it's also a sign of physical capacity, right? Like this is an exhausting, particularly before the invention of the saddle or the perfection of the saddle. You had to be really strong to ride. Arrow, shoot well, shoot a bow well, again, physically demanding, and to speak the truth. So actually that ratio, like 2/3 physical to 1/3 what we would call the trivium, would probably be more representative of how the ancient world, particularly the ancient and classical world, would view an adequate education. So that if you were book learned and had that capacity but had no real physical presence and you're weak and sickly, they're just like, yeah, we're not going to listen to you. We want people to be not just beautiful, although they would use that language, but they wanted vitality. They really thought that vitality was a sign that you were on the right track. And there's not, you can see the logic here. But what we've done is we've tried to extract these things, like, oh, there's the life of the mind, and there's no reason to even worry about the body. The body is the empty vessel, or the body is fallen clay. All this stuff, obviously you can see there's a lot of religious overtones to this, a lot of Christian notion of the body as a temple of evil, and that has been, it's debased, and that we have to, beat the body, or it has to be disciplined. We have all these concepts about struggles with our bodies. Yeah, the ancient Greeks, they weren't. You read them, they loved their bodies, right? And again, this is one reason it's great to read classical authors, is because you get this whole different sense about things of like just your physical body. They didn't see this huge division, which is not entirely, but in large part brought to you by the Christian demonization of the physical reality as a fallen world, and that anything that has to do with the fallen world is by definition tainted. And so get yourself out of that. Mind can be pure. That can help you reach and strive. There's a little bit of this in Plato, by the way, more than a little, but there's some of this in Plato. And that's why the Neoplatonic influence on Christianity is so huge. And so you can't just throw rocks at the Christians, but they took that concept and really ran with it, and was, developed over the course of several centuries. And so rather than being suspicious of our bodies and seeing that the health of our bodies and the health of our minds and our capacities are separate ideas, separate issues, separate things that you pursue as individual. No, the ancient world did not see this. They're like, no, you are a complete human. And a complete human needs to be rounded in their character, and part of that is to be physically vital. And again, this didn't mean you weren't. It's not like some guys would get their legs crippled in war and all this. That was fine, right? It's just if you're limping around, that's fine, as long as you're limping around. Like, oh yeah, that guy, he was fighting a war, he got injured. That makes it good on him, right? So it's not a notion of physical perfection or just beauty, although they did admire that in the way that we admire athletes today. But it was just this notion that you should be out there. And the way they incorporated this is pretty clearly is that they just did not have this as a separate part of life. One of the kind of ills, perhaps, of the modern world is that we really have a lot of encouragement to be sedentary, to sit behind computer screens, to sit and watch TV screens, to sit and read. But I'm certainly very guilty. No, I'm not guilty again. There's the Christian language. It's a certain thing that I have a bias towards is reading too much, because it's so sedentary. And so that notion of, the more you read, the better off it is, the more you're going to incorporate. Yeah, the ancients are very suspicious of the read some, learn some, think some, But there's a reason Plato's Academy was one that included walking. They would walk about and have these dialogues. So imagine that instead of sitting and reading philosophy, you, for every day for an hour and a half or 2 hours or 3 hours, you walked with people and discussed philosophical ideas. And so, you're walking sort of whatever that would translate into, maybe 9, 10, 11, 12 miles while participating in a philosophical discourse every day. So you're putting in 60, 70 miles a week doing your philosophy. So that, we just don't even have this concept anymore, right? It's practically vanished because we want that distinction has been drawn so clearly, and I think to a great damaging to our physical well-being. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm a big believer in walking. I walk every day. I compose most of my lectures while walking. That's why I don't use notes really, because I'm rehearsing them. I'm thinking about while they're walking, and a lot of stuff falls away, and I get inspirations, and sort of this sort of process really helps me think. So I tend to walk a significant amount. And what I find is when I don't walk, A, I don't feel well, and B, I don't think well. It's just that simple. I can read a lot. I can take a lot of notes from my reading. I can do all these other things. But if I don't walk, it just is this hazy mass of mud that sort of lives in my brain, and I don't feel that well, and I start feeling poorly, and I don't have any inspiration. And then when I walk, it starts to organize itself in my mind. Stuff falls away. I get whatever clarity, you be the judge, I arrive at. It does come from that. And so I think it's not only a cultural misunderstanding of what it means to think, but I think it actively damages our capacity to think and to rationate when we don't have processes that keep our physical being operating smoothly, being well, sleeping well, all of that. So, again, I'm a big believer in walking. The Greeks had the peripatetic school, but there's lots of ways to get exercise and to make sure that you're physically well. And so whatever works for the individual, knock yourself out. Riding, we don't live with horses anymore, but I think that's probably a great way to go, just because you're also then with an animal who has its own psychology, and so you've got to kind of compose yourself so the animal is composed, and that kind of interaction was probably spectacular and helpful as well, but a little trickier to have horses about these days, perhaps unfortunately. So an addition that the ancient world wouldn't see as an addition, it's just that we don't think of it anymore. That's kind of fallen away. In fact, graduate school, which I went to, I've never heard of a graduate school in the United States, maybe in other places, or in Europe, that has physical education as a requirement. That you have to take some physical education classes. And when you think about it, like, oh, well, that's silly. Why would we do that? Ancient Greeks wouldn't think this was silly at all. But so the further you go in your education, the less this is emphasized. So you can get a computer science degree probably at almost every major institution without ever really having taken any serious physical education classes. Rather than going, well, every semester you have to take half your course load is going to be physical education. We would think of this as a waste, as some sort of wrong, because we don't care about the health, vitality of the individual. We're concerned with these sorts of mechanical skills that we're imparting. Again, much more of a slave education than you might think on first view. So if we move a little far further in time, you get the Renaissance. And again, what's lost to us is how tight a circle. I mean, these were oligarchies. The ancient world, these were a handful of, even in the ancient, in Athens, but the number of people who quote unquote mattered in ancient Rome. I mean, we're talking a few hundred to a few thousand, depending on where you are and when you are. But it's a very small, extravagantly small minority. And so they took for granted socialization and being well. And part of rhetoric was learning to speak well with other people. And so this is why something like the symposium presents, people speaking together and other dialogues as well, of course. But that notion that you would be interacting socially all the time was just, again, taken for granted. And so, wow, we really need this sensibility that, again, we've lost. So you get something like a work like Castiglione's The Courtier from the Renaissance. And this is significant because one of the things, like the Renaissance, lots is happening, of course, but one of the things that was happening is you have an increasing number of courts And those courts are increasingly literate and they're increasingly interconnected. So literacy, writing, administration, all of these things are becoming increasingly important. And so you're getting larger collections of basically sort of administrative staff, but they really hadn't developed the full concept of administrative staff. And so they looked around like, who do we want around? We want somebody who can help us. If you're the Medicis, which started out as an international, as a banking and then international banking family, essentially. They were one of the pioneers here, like the Fuggers and such. This is where they came from, where a lot of their power came from. Like, okay, we've got to have lots of correspondence. We have to have lots of advisors. We have to have people doing the math. We have to have people keeping the books. This is all very important. But who do you want around? You want around pleasant, helpful, productive, interesting people. And so where in the ancient world, everybody that would be around would have been raised in courts, they'd be specifically trained in courts. Now you're getting this new sort of class is too strong a word, but a new group of people, which they called the courtiers, they're not just noblemen who are there because they're noble. They need to get stuff done. They need to be ambassadors. They need to negotiate treaties. They need to understand the law. But we hang out with them a lot. So we want them to be pleasant and entertaining and fun and add something to the life of the court. And so that shift caused the need for the book, because what had been assumed is that all the people that mattered would have been raised in an environment that would produce the kind of skills and socialization that you would expect. As the demand for the services of the courtiers grew outside of what a court would normally have, you're going to run out of nephews at some point. To a point you don't have, right? You're going to have more ministers, more advisors, all of that. You needed this sort of more educational model. And this is where a book like, and there's other ones, but Castiglione's The Courtiers is the most famous one, where, by the way, it's a great example also there because they're discussing what it means to be a good courtier. They don't just come to conclusions. You can draw some conclusions, but they're definitely debating it. You can see that there's different sides, different inferences, different concepts of what makes a good courtier and what you should be shooting for. So it's also a great example of discussion rather than conclusion. But what it emphasizes is something, again, that I think we've lost, that the ancient world would have just taken for granted all the way up till the Renaissance, and that is that anything you're going to do, or most anything you're going to do as part of a social group. And so gaining skills for effective interaction with people, it really matters, right? Like this, you want to think about and cultivate your capacity to work with other people because, hey presto, you're going to be doing this. This is not like, this isn't crazy, right? Like, what are you going to do? But we have this model where it's like, oh, if you're a programmer, then you sit in a room with a computer and occasionally somebody slips a note under your door and says, hey, do this project. And so you tap away on that project. And when you're done, you slip the note back under the door. And this process just continues with this no social interaction. And of course, anybody who's ever worked in an office or a company or tried to do any project that involved more than one person knows this is nonsense. That people go, oh, what do all these administrative people do, blah, blah, blah. And of course, again, I'm very quick to criticize all this, but functionally, if you're going to coordinate a lot of people to try and do something, and if you're going to do something of scale, often you need to coordinate at least a few people, you need to interact with people. And the more successfully you can interact with them, the easier it's going to be, the better it's going to be, the more pleasant it's going to be for everyone. And so thinking about and developing social skills is clearly a huge part of what it means to interact successfully in the world, if for no other reason than to avoid pain. Again, it's one of my favorite sayings from William James, is this notion that the purpose of an education is to recognize a gentleman. And what he meant by that is to recognize someone that is not going to create a whole bunch of problems for you by being, vicious in some way, mean-spirited, deeply ignorant, right? All of the potential pitfalls. And if you can recognize someone who does not have those characteristics, you go, oh, This is going to make working with this person or accomplishing something with them ever so much more pleasant, easy, and the likelihood of the outcome potentially vastly more successful. And so this fundamental notion of thinking about how, and again, the Courtier is a great example because it doesn't necessarily provide a clear bunch of examples that, oh, you have to do this. It's like a 6-step program. No, it's a bunch of people who spend a bunch of chapters arguing about a bunch of things. By the way, women appear also. This is one of the big breakthroughs of the Renaissance is women start making an appearance as important characters here. So thinking about and spending time reflecting on how we interact with other people, how we want to interact with other people, what we want from them, what expectations we should have of ourselves to deliver to them, like how do we want them to receive us, this sort of thought process and notions of self-presentation for the purposes of, again, being efficacious in the world, having the kind of results that you want is really vitally important. And it's often, there's so many different examples of, they say, oh, if you go in for an interview, the interviewees, they have these different studies, but basically, before you've said anything, they've already made up their minds, right? Like, and people go, oh, this is racism or sexism or blah, blah. There's probably a fair bit of that, no doubt, but it's also just a matter of like deportment. We don't have deportment classes anymore. In the Renaissance world, earlier and later, by the way, but for centuries, particularly in Europe by China. China's next level on this, but even in Europe, barbaric Europe, deportment, like a dance instructor, would be the most important instructor because how you moved signaled who you were, right? Like this told people just the way you presented yourself. And people talk about dressing now, like, oh, how they want to dress, and people say, oh, I want to dress for comfort, or I want to dress however I want, or whatever. It's like, great, freedom of fashion, that's wonderful. What I don't hear people speak about is like, oh, I want to dress for other people, right? I want to dress in a way that other people might find it appealing. They might find it like, oh, what am I communicating? How do I communicate that? If I dress like, oh, I just want to be comfortable all the time, that's great. But then people should read that as, oh, you're just somebody who only cares about themselves and their own comfort, because this is what you're communicating with your dress, which is maybe fine. That's great. In a lot of places, this doesn't work that well, right? And the notion also that people would say, oh, that's a fairly selfish, self-centered way to dress. And it is. I think sort of like, okay, Pharisee squaresy. Like, I don't know how else you would debate that too much. But this notion of going, oh, if I want to make an environment that other people find charming and attractive, if I want to be in a room with 10 people, they're dressed in ways that are charming and attractive, so I should dress in a way that's charming and attractive. So I'm bringing as a gift my presence and my person, and thinking of it that way. What am I bringing? What am I giving? What am I providing? It's a very different way to think about it, and certainly it's something that was never brought up in my education. In fact, I mentioned Castiglione's The Courtier because it's one of those books that you read and you go, oh my goodness, like, wow, you can think about the world this way? It just kind of blew my mind, coming from the world I did, which cared nothing about any of this. I'm like, oh. And again, there is this lie. It's like, oh, well, none of this matters. You can dress how you want. You can do what you want. If you have a sufficient skill level, maybe. But if people look around, they go, well, how did these people who aren't that skilled or don't have that much background get to where they are? Some ways, it's just pure nepotism, right? The guy's nephew. The other guy owns the company, whatever. Often, though, it is also simply like, oh, they're really good at all the social stuff, which is functionally what a manager is supposed to be good at. They're often terrible, of course, but functionally, they're supposed to be good at managing the peoples, which means there's people person. So do you want the best programmer running your programming division? Companies make this mistake all the time, but it's a terrible idea because then your best programmer isn't programming. They're trying to manage people, and they probably suck at that. So, these sorts of problems are everywhere. and being able to even think about them and reflect on them. We just don't even talk about this. Again, it's as if they don't matter. But it's hard to imagine a future, or at least I have a hard time imagining a future, in which I'm just not going to be interacting with people. And when we tried this, hello pandemic, it turns out everybody got depressed. Not everybody, almost everybody got depressed and found it a hateful process. And it's like, yeah, because we're social creatures. And so what you get with Castiglione's The Courtier, by the way, they also emphasize physical exercise and fitness, is this emphasis on like, hey, you're going to have the skills you need. You got to be able to be an ambassador, but you also need to, let's see, should you be a military person? Should you be charming? Should you know history? Should you be able to recite poetry, right? What is it that you're bringing to the table that makes it great for you to be around? Because if people like it when you're around, you're probably going to have a better chance of being a successful courtier than if you don't. And of course, the extreme version of this is someone who everybody loves but has no skills at all, right? And like, why is that person here? Well, they're just great. Everybody loves them. But we don't know why they're here, right? They don't provide anything. They don't do anything, but by God, they're friendly and we like having them around. So these, that maybe that gets to some absurd extreme as well. But this is the idea that you get in the Renaissance that I think we've almost completely lost. The notions of deportment, self-presentation, being entertaining, being interesting, being polite, learning how to engage people, which, again, imagine your future with no people in it. No, you want to be with people. You want to interact with them successfully. Why don't we think about this? We've just sort of eliminated it. And that would have been a classic part of the ancient world. Finally, the third part of this, and I'm going to appeal to Taoism here, and the third part is in two sections, of course, just to make it confusing. And the first one is the Tao. It's very suspicious, Taoism and the Tao Te Ching in particular, but Taoism in general, very suspicious of abstraction. And if there's anything the modern world has done a good job of, is abstracting everything to the 27th level of abstraction. And what this does is it's a self-baffling process. And just to give you an example, when people talk about things like, oh, we want a good economy, it's like, all right, what does that mean? Like, good for whom? Good in what way? What is an economy for? More importantly, who is an economy for? So, and people, this is what economists argue about endlessly, of course, but people keep saying this, we want a good economy, we want a good economy. What does that mean concretely, not in the abstract? And when people read the Tao Te Ching or read about Taoism generally, they're often baffled by things that really aren't that confusing. And there's unfortunately lots of mysticism is put around this. Some of it is very confusing and a bit mystical, but most of it is perfectly clear and concrete. And right in the opening is the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. And sometimes this is translated as the path that can be told is not the eternal path. And there's different translations. And people go, ooh, what does that mean? It's like, oh, the name of a thing is not the thing. Period. It's not, it's not that confusing. It's just hard to think because we're so inundated with language and we're so inundated with abstractions that come with language that we forget that the language itself is something, but it's not the real. The word stone is not a stone. The word love is not the emotion we want or attachment that we want to feel. But we get endlessly sidetracked by this, and so so it goes on in the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, and it says, "The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things." So when you start naming things, you just get this mass confusion. Like the language does not reduce confusion; it increases confusion. It's the nameless, it's the things that aren't named that are clear. This is where everything comes from. And so a lot that people think of as being confusing about the Tao or Tao Te Ching and Taoism is not confusing. It is simply this. It's like, hey, don't trust language. Now it's hard because we're so used to language, we're so used to abstraction, and the further we get away from the natural world, the more abstraction we encounter. This is what happens. And so we're baffled by this. But it's not just the Tao, by the way. Again, go back to classical Greece, the Socratic dialogue or the Platonic dialogues that feature Socrates. He does this. He walks up to people and says, "What is courage?" And like, "Oh, I know what courage is," like this. And then they start talking about it and they realize they don't really know what courage is. These sometimes feel slightly disingenuous, by the way, because some of these people will go, "Look, you're in battle. You do the right thing, right? You could come up with better examples, and I think make bigger arguments." But what happens is Socrates pushes them into abstraction, and the more they try to abstract and get to this higher level of understanding of courage, the more trouble they get in, which is, of course, the problem, because that is the whole point that he's driving at, right? He kind of pushes them to try to get into abstract ideas and concepts, and of course, that's where they founder. You founder in abstraction. You don't get clarity in abstraction often. And so the Tao is very suspicious of this. And so that is one of the problems that I think we see. So again, if you look at the trivium, like, wow, look at that trap. Like, oh, if you can read well and write well, if you can do logic well, and if you can speak well, hey, you're in business. And the Tao wants to go, now, wait a second. But again, what's happened is we've abstracted out, again, abstraction, we've pulled out in our society the other half, or a half, I don't know, other part of this, which is that clear, present contact with the world, the physical, palpable, material world that would shape those concepts. And so if you think about something like, again, being at the gym all the time, and people go, "What's strong?" And they're like, "Well, Ed's strong." And people go, "Okay, yeah, we know he can lift a lot." Like, everybody has these sorts of more clear concepts. But when you go something like, "Oh, what's the global GDP?" Like, wow. Like, what is GDP measuring? It is a useful measure. Is it useful within the context that we're talking about now? And so a lot of the concepts that we have, and one of the reasons for the trivium is sort of the self-reinforcing circle, is because the danger of abstraction grows the further you move into a modern literate world. And this is one of the things, again, Socrates famously did not trust writing. He didn't write anything as far as we know, and he argued you shouldn't write things down because the problem with writing is you could not interrogate the writer. It was dead on the page. And he thought that if you couldn't really know the heart of the person who was writing something and talk to them about it and interrogate them, then, or at least have a conversation with them, interrogate's probably too strong, then you really didn't have a sense, are they trying? What do they mean by this? What's their experience, right? All the physical things. Again, as I mentioned in the courtier, right? All those social elements. Like, let's know the heart of the person. What are they really driving at? Oh, when they said this, did they really mean that this is what courage was? Oh, I know why they said that. This they're pulling on an example that they've explained to me, and I've known them, and I've seen them being courageous. So, or they're like, oh, I've seen them being cowardly. I know that person is a coward. So now they're trying to come up with a definition of courage that makes them not feel like a coward. This is all nonsense, even if it sounds good. Right? And so what you lose with writing is you get this distance from, quote unquote, the real, of course, ontology, an incredibly vexed series, and epistemology. So I know I'm less like walking in a minefield of philosophy here, and I'm stepping on every mind. I get it. But this is what the Tao emphasizes in part. And remember, if you're going to be a Taoist, you're probably already a Confucius. So it is an antidote to an incredibly powerful emphasis on these abstract texts within a formal court environment. And it's trying to work strongly against that and give an alternative to that sort of abstraction that you get with something like the Trivium or with the Confucius, a Confucian education from China. And this is the second part of that, besides the suspicion of abstraction, which again Socrates and Plato share, you have the notion of return to nature. And this is where I think that you really do get a break, and where the ancient Chinese tradition does have something very different from anything I've ever really seen in the classical ancient tradition. As far as being dominant, I mean, you can find pieces here and there, but as really a dominant thrust. But Taoism, hugely formative on Buddhism and Chinese literature, Chinese philosophy, blah, just massively influential. And this is the notion that you look to nature as a model. And the reason to go walking in nature or to sit in nature is to find answers to your questions, essentially, right? If you want to know what should I do about global GDP, look at a mountain, go sit by a tree, watch a stream flow, right? Because that's where the answer is going to be. And for Taoism, it's very simple. Again, it's people like mystical and all this. Sure, there's these elements, but the thrust of it is not that confusing. It's very straightforward. It's just counterintuitive from our society. And that is like, are we part of the universe? Yes. Are we part of nature? Yes. Therefore, if you want to know about yourself and you want to know about how things work, go look at nature, because there it is. Ta-da! Right? Like, this is not it's like you're like a stream. That's the argument that Taoism makes. Streams are part of nature, rivers are part of nature, you're part of nature. Therefore, in some ways, you must be like a river. So let's go sit by a river and see what we can figure out. And take that as our model. Now, again, like the notion that we're brains in jars and that you have this divide between the physical and the mental, one of the decides we've decided on in our culture, and that's grown radically over the modern era, is the notion of saying, oh, nature is over there, and what man does is over here. And that these two things, like, really don't matter. You can see this, by the way, and I'm both, I love the idea of national parks. I think it's one of the great inventions in American history that we would set aside huge tracts of land. Like, so on one hand, I get it. On the other hand, it's this weird notion that nature is over there. So if you're in Seattle, which I just picked because I used to live in that area, it's very liberal, lots of money donated to natural parks and to, environmental causes, blah, blah, blah. But one of the most controversial things is cutting down trees, because lots of old trees in Seattle, and these wealthy, liberal, Democrat voting, biodiversity, vegan people are like, hey, that tree is shading my house. I want to cut it down. So a tree in a national park, good, because that really doesn't have anything to do with me. I like the idea that nature is out there. But if we said, hey, let's re-wild Seattle, like, let's really just see what we can do to take out as much of the stuff that is, sort of the modern infrastructure, and rewild it and put people where you have to be in contact with the outdoors, with grass, with trees, with, let's put cougars back in the city, right? That'll make things exciting. That kind of notion. We really resist this, like really, really resist this. Paris right now, by the way, is trying to get, I think, 60 or 70% tree cover. They're greening the city, and one of the ways they're doing this is they're pulling, which is amazing to think about, they're pulling out lanes, particularly in large roundabouts and on streets, and just planting them in trees. They're making little urban forests and just planting trees where there used to be car lanes. And it turns out that pretty quickly, this turns your city green. And so they're on track to meet their target and exceed it, which is pretty impressive in some ways. But that's different from this notion of, oh, nature's out there and man is over here. And if I want to go out in nature, we have a lot of commercials for that, then you get an SUV and you drive out into nature and you spend a little time there and you go, wow, that was beautiful and nice. And then you go back to the real world where real things happen and important things go on. So that philosophy of the division between man and nature, again, Neoplatonic, also heavily Christian. Nature is fallen, man is potentially trying to redeem themselves, is just rife throughout. I mean, like, wow, is this unbelievably powerful in Western cultural and generally the United States in particular. The Tao says no. And I think, again, it's one of these things that I can make arguments against it, ontology, epistemology, blah, blah. But basically, it's like, okay, are we natural? Yes. Or are we part of the universe? Yes. So if we think about, watch, and understand how nature works, at some level we must be learning about ourselves, right? We become self-baffling with abstraction. So it is sort of the flip side, or a part of this notion of trying to avoid abstraction or not get confused by it, is to spend more time just, thinking about how nature works, thinking about how rivers work, stones, how, birds, like the whole thing of like really, and it's not just like studying them as scientific entities. It's studying them as, like, the classic example that I always like is like water flows downhill. It does a lot of stuff. It never bothers. It just goes downhill. And so why don't you just do that, right? Do what comes easy for you. What is easy for you to do? What's natural for you to do? What makes you feel good when you do it? What do you do by instinct, right? These things that ask these questions. And you go, oh, okay, I'll be like a river. And if you're like a river, it's like, oh, wow, look, the rivers do have stuff to teach us. And all the evidence is that the rivers do have a lot of stuff to teach us. And I've mentioned before, stones apparently have the most to teach us, but we're so bad at being ourselves that we're very unstone-like, I think. And so it's hard to get their wisdom. But that concept of going, hey, one way to really clarify your ideas, to really understand yourself and your world, is to A, de-abstract it, and B, go to nature again, reduces the abstraction because there doesn't seem to be a lot of signs and words attached to things. Although they do this in national parks where they put up signs and everything. It kind of drives me crazy, but I get it. They're trying to like historical context and all this. I'm like, no, stop putting words, stop putting abstractions here. We'll bring enough with us. Don't worry. People will bring plenty of abstraction with them. And then you just sit and be or walk or spend time on the beach and reflect. And rarely, by the way, I almost never talk to anybody who they go, oh, I just, I walk along the beach and the wind's blowing and I feel great. And it's like, okay, why? Like, what is it about that experience? And like, oh, it's so natural, all this. Like, okay, yeah, what is it? And I think a big part of it is we're just slowly, particularly as if you walk a ways along the beach or in the mountains or something, like a lot of the abstraction just goes away because there's, generally not anything to buy. So the whole like trying to figure out values and there's all this relative past and present tends to get kind of fuzzy, right? Like kind of drop down, your mind sort of frees up. All these things kind of happen. And again, I don't think they're that mystical. It just is this notion of going, oh, we have all this modern world. We have all these abstractions. It's very human to have them. But also, we're not just that. And again, like the physical element, like trying to cut ourselves off from our physical bodies, the notion that we are only words, that we're only things on pages, that we are all about computer screens, it's just clearly fallacious. And when our education systems and our social patterns so heavily emphasize that, then, I think by definition, something has gone seriously wrong. And so when you think about the trivium as a whole, of this idea, what was the core thrust of the trivium? And again, it was people who mattered, because if you're getting this kind of education in the ancient world, you were an important person. So start with that. You are an important person. Your ideas, desires, and values really matter, not just to you, but to everybody, because you're probably going to be an important leader in the community. And so how do we want to educate these people? Well, we want to make sure that they're thinking clearly. And the way you do that is writing, so they can write their own thoughts, and reading, so they can read the thoughts of other great people, reflect on them, and communicate them. Logic, so that they can understand their own arguments, the arguments they're presented with, and they can think clearly about themselves and the world. Grammar, so that they can communicate this in social settings, so that their ideas can be made manifest and palpable. And then again, with the Renaissance notion of both exercise, being physical and healthy as part of that, vitality, and then trying to avoid the pitfalls that the modern world, they had them in the ancient world. It's hilarious to think how old Taoism is, that it was talking about this that long ago, thousands of years ago. But again, it's responding to this Confucian tradition that emphasized, basically what we think of as an education, the books, the writing, the memorization, these sorts of things, the very formalized etiquettes. And it's going, hey, wait a second, like, don't forget, you're also this. There is this part of you. There's the physical part of you. There's nature that also informs and can help us understand, again, ourselves and the world. Because if you think you understand the world and you don't understand nature, obviously something is wrong someplace, because that's just ridiculous. This is not a, sort of not a real functional thing, or at least you've missed a big part of it. And so that would be my argument for, and it is an argument, by the way, for what a modern trivium would look like. Again, skills for reading and writing, for self-expression, and to explore the world and to spend time with the great minds of history. Logic and rhetoric, so that you can understand and think clearly about that and then express it. And then the combination of physical health and a withdrawal from abstraction, at least periodically, so that you have this other impulse, because we do forget that we're not brains in jars, that we are incarnate in a universe that has sort of guidelines and rules for living creatures that apply to us just like everything else. And so that combination, which really is the thrust of what the ancient world was after and what they were trying to do, has, by the way, demonstrated for thousands of years that it creates great effective minds that have produced works of art, conquered empires, whether that's good or not, I don't know, has built beautiful buildings, has transformed our understanding of medicine, right? Like, we live basically on a pile of gold, of riches beyond compare, because of the many, many, many people who were educated and raised within this sort of context. And so we know this works. This is not a question. It's not I wonder if this will produce dividends. What's very questionable is whether our modern system that we've developed really does deliver for the individual the kind of capacities and experiences and abilities that the trivium did, that for millennia and across many civilizations and cultures. I just used the Greek model because it's the one most prevalent between Greek and Rome with the Western world, but you see again the Confucian Taoist tradition has very similar things. The Persian tradition, which I've quoted, has similar things. And so you see this spanning many civilizations that has produced all kinds of amazing works that are still with us. And we know that. So it's really not me speculating whether or not these are good ideas and work. It's like the evidence is very powerful. I would say the real question is, why do we spend so much time with the system we have now? And is it seem to be helping people as much as the ancient system? And given the way people tend to feel and how alienated they tend to feel and the kind of waves of depression and everything we see, I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. I think perhaps no, probably not. And again, as I mentioned before, if you find yourself feeling like, oh, I'm trapped in a job that I don't like and I don't find fulfilling, in essence, this is to say I've been educated but not by the trivium, because this is really the core of the trivium, is to make it so that you can find ways to fulfill your life, and sustaining yourself is part of fulfilling your life, right? To fulfill your life in ways that make you feel good and powerful and valuable, and that you have efficacy in the world. That was the goal. And again, a couple of thousand years of evidence that system that I've articulated, maybe not very well, is effective at that. So, the trivium, a modern consideration. Thank you very much.